Welcome back, everybody. Hope you enjoyed your lunch. We are going to get started with an exciting afternoon. We just had two fabulous speakers this morning, and we have two more for you. I have the great pleasure of being able to introduce our next presenter, Carolyn Turner. Carolyn Turner is the Ohio Literacy Lead at the Ohio Department of Education and Workforce. In her role, Carolyn collaborates with local, regional, and state level instructional leaders to strengthen their capacity to implement evidence-based reading instruction within the MTSS framework. She is a doctoral student in the Reading Science program at Mount St. Joseph University, and she is a certified dyslexia interventionist. A passionate advocate for reading science, Carolyn brings a wealth of knowledge about effective evidence-based approaches to teaching reading. She works tirelessly to ensure that educational leaders are equipped with the knowledge, skills, and strategies necessary to sustain meaningful change and to drive improved reading outcomes for all of our students. Please join me in greeting Carolyn Turner.
All right. Good afternoon, everybody. Yes, I am Carolyn Turner, and thank you for that introduction. So I'm hoping you can see the code on the screen and everything. I think you're supposed to do something with that as you get signed in today, and then I'll bring something back up again so you can check out of this session as well. But we're going to spend some time this afternoon, I know, after your hopefully delicious lunch. Hopefully the carb coma doesn't set in too much as you're sitting here listening to this presentation. But this morning, or this afternoon rather, we're going to be talking about how we can support elementary students with dyslexia or even other reading difficulties as well. And we're going to really situate that with effective instructional practices within a multi-tiered system of support. So yes, my name is Carolyn Turner. I'll be your presenter for this session. I live in Cincinnati, Ohio, which is the home of the Bengals and the Reds and Graders and Skyline. But full disclosure, I lived in Cincinnati for 10 years and I never once had Skyline. So they say it's good, but I actually prefer Leo's. We've been to Detroit a number of times, and that seems to be my chili, my Coney dog of preference. But like Kate said, I'm the literacy lead here in Ohio, and I support our schools and districts in implementing evidence-based practices within a multi-tiered system of support. So in this session, we're going to really look at how the MTSS framework supports students with dyslexia and other reading difficulties. We're going to really define the essential components of differentiated core literacy instruction that's aligned with this body of evidence, this body of research that's called the science of reading, to help meet a very diverse student population and all of their needs. And then we'll also talk about some practical tools and strategies to support reading development for our students with dyslexia or other word level reading difficulties. So let's talk a little bit about where all of this situates within a multi-tiered system of support. So this graphic that I have on the screen is probably familiar to many of you. It shows the essential components of multi-tiered system of support. And we often think of the tiered delivery system as being the essential mechanism to help support our students either through intervention or enrichment. But we also have to consider how we're teaming either within grade level, across grade levels. We have to consider how we're using assessments, what assessments we're using, and how we're using those assessments to plan very purposeful and intentional instruction and intervention. And of course, we have to use a continuous database decision-making model to constantly refine and adjust our assessments and our instruction. So MTSS, the model, the framework, can be used to prevent academic, social, emotional, and behavioral difficulties. It's not intended to be a route to special education or the route to an IEP, but it really is at its very core and premise a very preventative model. And then we can also use it to identify students who are at risk and learners who have characteristics of dyslexia or other specific learning disabilities. So I know this whole session, this whole conference, symposium is on dyslexia, but I want to bring us back to the very grounding definition that your state uses, and our state uses a version of this in our dyslexia guidebook as well. And so we're going to kind of do an a la Anita Archer choral reading. I can't hear you, but I'm going to trust that you're going to participate right along with me. I'm going to start reading the definition, and when we come to the words that are in bold face. I'm going to stop reading and I want you to pick up with me or pick up where the bold words are. Okay, here we go. So dyslexia is a specific learning disorder that is neurobiological in origin, characterized by these difficulties, typically, that is often in relation to other cognitive abilities. Additionally, this specific reading disorder may include secondary consequences such as that can impede the growth of vocabulary and background knowledge and lead to social, emotional, and behavioral difficulties. So in other words, when we think about dyslexia, we're thinking about that reading disorder that primarily is characterized by word level reading difficulties that really kind of start from the phonological processing weaknesses that it's hard to identify them in the absence of a student's response to effectively phonologically oriented instruction. In other words, that instruction that's really tapping into, and I'm so glad that Carolyn Strom was able to give her presentation first, that instruction that's really tapping into the decoding pathway, right? That dorsal network that's connecting the speech sound system to the letter sound system in our brains. And we'll talk more about that in just a second. But when we take this at its very premise and we're thinking about commitments that we can make at the very start of learning through Tier 1, it's really all about helping our students to understand and teach the language system and thinking about what we're teaching, how we're teaching it, but also making sure that we're maximizing the academic learning time. So let's kind of parse this out about what we mean by the language system and what we're teaching. So our students who have severe and persistent learning difficulties, even our students who are progressing just fine with the language system, we want to make sure that our instruction is really including the components of the English language system. And for that, we're thinking about, the phonology of our language, right? Where these speech sounds and the structure of the speech of our English language is coming from. We want to make sure that we're making a very specific and explicit connection to the orthography, right? Where those words are stored back in the brain's letterbox. And that each of those sounds has a connection to symbols in the English language. We want to think about the syntax and the sentence structure of how our English language is developed. And of course, what words mean. And what words mean a lot of times has to do with their morphology and the etymology. And so I borrowed this from Marianne Wolf because she uses the possum analogy to really help us think about the phonology, the orthography, the syntax, the semantics, and the morphology of our instruction as we're helping our students learn this English code and learn to be better readers. We also want to think about how we're teaching, right? That quality of instruction. And I have up here on the screen explicit instruction. And I know your state has done lots and lots of work around explicit instruction with Dr. Anita Archer. And so you also know that when we think about explicit instruction, it's much, much more than just I do, we do, you do, that gradual release of responsibility. Yes, it's that, but it's also about practice and the right type of practice and how we design our lessons and how we deliver our lessons. And then high quality feedback is also encompassed within explicit instruction. And so when we provide feedback that is very goal directed, constructive, immediate, timely, and also positive and respectful, our students are able to then learn more deeply about what we are teaching them. Our learners who have reading difficulties, they're working really hard. And when we help our students feel that their efforts are worthwhile and appreciated, that goes a long way to their motivation and their engagement. So when we're talking about these commitments to Tier 1, I also want to bring up the idea of maximizing your academic learning time. Really looking at your lessons to make sure you are teaching the critical content, the content of the language systems, that phonology and orthography and syntax, semantics, and morphology. So teaching that critical content in a very explicit way. Looking at your school day, are you starting your lessons on time? Do you have routines to teach all of the things? Are you avoiding digressions as much as possible? You know, kids are really good at getting their teachers off track, especially off track from the things they don't want to avoid, or they don't want to do. And so when we can minimize distractions and avoid digressions, you know, get those transition times shored up, that can help us to maximize our academic learning time so that we can use our small groups to support whole group instruction. So before we get into some of the specifics of Tier 1 instruction, we want to think about, again, Tier 1 as it situates within a multi-tiered system of support. And we can intensify our Tier 1 instruction by differentiating instruction through whole group instruction, as well as small group core instruction that supports and gives extra practice within the core. We also want to think about intensifying that instruction through those supplemental reading interventions that you might be delivering, right? Those standard treatment protocol interventions. And then finally, for the learners who do have severe persistent learning difficulties, who need the most intensive services, thinking about how we use that DBI, that database individualization process, to make sure that we are really honing in on the discrete skills and giving enough time, enough practice, enough opportunity to master the skills that need to be learned in order to move on in the next learning progression. So when we think about this multi-tiered system of support, whether it be core or intervention or intensive intervention, it's really about accelerating reading achievement, right? We don't want our learners to just move along in the system. We really want to see that go upness in their progress monitoring and making progress towards their ultimate end of the year or grade level goals. All right. So when we think about the difference maker in each of these tiers, it's really about the more explicitness, the more opportunities to practice, right? Really thinking about that we do, that middle piece of it, all right? For some learners, it might take just a few opportunities to practice. For other learners, it might take 100 opportunities to practice a particular skill. And then we still need to keep revisiting and interleaving all of that instruction. So that's just kind of a initial kind of get us going and thinking about where all of this situates within a multi-tiered system of support. But let's just talk about some essential components of that differentiated core literacy instruction. And I want to bring it back to perhaps what Dr. Strom talked with you about this morning, in that our brains weren't designed to read. They were designed for language, but they were never really born to read. And so the reading brain really has to be built. And I'm not going to go into much detail with this because you heard the brilliance of Dr. Strom this morning. But I just want to bring back to the forefront the fact that our brains are primed for language, but we have to systematically build the other systems, especially that sound symbol connection that's in that dorsal network or that decoding network. And that's where many of our learners with those word level reading difficulties need the most support. Of course, we want to bring this back to the simple view of reading. Yes, word recognition is essential, but it's not sufficient. And so while we are thinking about those really systematic, explicit phonics instruction, we also want to think about how we're infusing that language support, because literacy is really predicated on that language element. You have this graphic in your dyslexia handbook, so I'm not going to belabor this point, but you know that learning to read is part of a progression, right? And we build upon that progression over time. And we start with understanding what our learners can do, and then we build upon what they still need to do to achieve grade level and beyond expectations. So when we think about the development of literacy skills, we're thinking about how we build up to that fluent automatic word recognition. And we need to start thinking about the language, the structure of our English language, the phonological system, and how that phonological system is attached to the squiggly lines that are on the page that we know as letters, and that those letters are representing sounds. And because we only have 26 letters and we have about 44 sounds in the English language, we have to teach all of the variability that goes into all of those speech sound systems. It's not crazy. There are rules, there are patterns, but it has to be taught in a really systematic way. When we do that, we think about and we help our learners make connection between those sounds and the symbols that are on the page. And that's in a sense what you're doing when you teach phonics, right? You're teaching that the sounds are represented by symbols, and you're teaching them how to blend and, blend those sounds back together again, and then bring them all back apart when you go for the encoding and the spelling component of it. But I want to point out to you too that recognition of the sounds and the symbols and teaching that code also leads to sight word recognition. And that can be a really big barrier to our learners with dyslexia or other word level reading difficulties. They don't have enough words stored in the brain's letterbox for instant and automatic retrieval. And so when we build this bank of sight words, which those of you who have been through professional development, perhaps with letters, have learned that a sight word is any word that we can read as if by sight. As a proficient reader, every word that you see on my screen is a sight word. Your brain has learned to decode it, and it's stored there. So as soon as it comes in through your optic nerve, your brain immediately processes those sounds, and boom, you have that word. That practice is what's needed for our learners with reading difficulties. And when we have all of those sight words at our disposal, that's when the fluency and the automaticity kicks in. But just remember, underlying all that is language, it's vocabulary, it's background knowledge. So that's really then at the heart of your instruction and what we think of in terms of structured literacy. So when we look at structured literacy, it really does start with screening, universal screening, because universal screening can help us identify not only our students who are at risk, but it can also tell us the health of our overall system. And it helps us to understand, okay, these are the components of language. These are the components of the explicit and systematic instruction that we should be providing. So I need to be thinking about how much of my instruction is including phonemic awareness. Am I teaching basic, advanced decoding? Am I including morphology across the grade levels? How am I teaching spelling? Does my spelling follow my phonics scope and sequence? Where am I in oral text reading, right? So that I can actually listen to and attend to the mistakes that students are making and then help plan my purposeful instruction through that. How are they in their vocabulary and their sentence structure? Because underlying good, solid, fluent reading is that language piece. And so if we're trying to do this kind of ping pong and this balancing act of trying to, understand what words mean and then also be fluent in our reading, that could present as some disfluent reading as well. And so we want to make sure that we're teaching those skills in a logical scope and sequence so that our kids don't leave our grade levels with Swiss cheese, right? Holes, pockets of knowledge here and pockets of knowledge there without a continuum and aligned system. So just a final reminder, just remember my friend the possum as you are looking at your lesson plans and really thinking through all those components of structured literacy, which are essential, especially for our learners who have dyslexia or have severe and persistent learning difficulties. So before we go any further, we hear a lot about phonemic awareness, and I just wanted to give a nod to the role of phonemic awareness because it is necessary. But sometimes we get caught up in the notion that phonemic awareness is the end-all be-all of our reading instruction. And I just want to give a nod to the fact that phonemic awareness is necessary, but it's not sufficient. And we want to remember what the role is of phonemic awareness, and that is to support the alphabetic principle. I like to think of it as like a placeholder, a parking spot for where the grapheme, where the letter is going to go. So let me give you an example of that. This is a picture of a sock. So say sock. Okay, good. Now let's think about the phonemes in the word sock. S, a, k. All right. We now have phoneme awareness. We have an awareness of the phonemes in the word sock. S, a, k. There's 3 of them. But now we need to take it that next step. All right, we parsed out those sounds, and now we need to think about, okay, in the act of reading, what are the letters that are going to be in those placeholders? So we have the S for the S, the A for the O, and the CK for the K sound. And there's where the instruction comes in, right? We have to teach that K at the end of a word that has a short vowel preceding it has the CK short vowel marker. So that's the role of phonemic awareness. We can do some manipulation, right? If I change out the ah in sock for an I, now I have the word sick. And now let's think about the spelling of the word sick. And then we'll go back and we'll reread that. So I'll show you some examples of that in just a second. But we also want to think about the role of phonics. Okay, phonics also is essential, but not sufficient. The role of phonics is to help us break the code, right? To crack that code of that speech to print process, to build that dorsal decoding network. It helps us to connect language comprehension with word recognition. Because if you think about the 4-part processing system, yes, we have our sounds and our symbols. We're going to read the word, but then we have to confirm that word through the meaning and the context systems, which are those backup processors. So we're grounding it. Phonics helps us to ground our reading of words in the sound symbol relationship and using those as our primary vehicle, our primary mechanisms for reading words. And then it also lays the foundation, though, for statistical learning, because the more words you can read, our brains start to be self-seeking and self-teaching, right? And so as we start to store more words, our brains can make those automatic connections through the consolidation of our learning. So what I want you to do is think about the programs that you are using to teach phonics, all right? And I want you to use your underlying knowledge. And really, we encourage people to be smarter than your programs, right? Look for what's there, but also look for what's not there in your program. So think about whether the programs you're using have a well-defined scope and sequence. Think about whether they are starting with easier, least complex skills and then moving to more complex skills. Right? We don't want to lump everything into one lesson. Like we're not going to teach, all the sounds of A in one lesson or all the sounds of the letter C in one lesson. We want to make sure we're progressing from more frequent to less frequent skills, easiest skills to more complex skills. We want to teach each skill directly without any assumptions. Right? It's not going to harm anybody by giving some explicit instruction, even if they already know it, right? So really teach those skills explicitly and don't assume that they already know a particular skill. Help students to practice the skills to mastery before moving on, right? That's that really intentional, I do, we do, you do, opportunities to practice, the engagement that you give with students. And then make sure that you have cumulative skill practice within your lesson progression, starting your lessons with that review, right? That retrieval practice, that interleaving of a skill perhaps that's already been taught. And then I also want you to think about your English learners, your multilingual learners, and ensure that your phonics instruction is also bringing in some elements of language, some elements of vocabulary. Even think about your simple CVC words, like I'm thinking of the word cap, right? I can have a cap on my head, but I can also put a cap on the bottle. I can cap off the number in these sections, right, to top it all off. So think about the vocabulary and the background knowledge and the attention to new sounds in the language that perhaps your English learners, your multilingual learners may need. And then, of course, if you're providing interventions or extra assistance for multilingual learners, really think about where two languages diverge. And that is where your screening, your diagnostic assessments can really come into play to help you determine what your learners know and then what they still need to acquire. So I mentioned really taking a critical look at your lesson plans, at the programs that you're using, and really think about that systematic plan for instruction. Do they have components of a systematized plan, right? Does every lesson have the same set of routines? Our learners, especially our learners who are having difficulty, they thrive on that routine. They want to know what they need to know what's coming next, right? They need to know what's going to happen next in that lesson sequence and to really make sure it's carried over from lesson to lesson. So we want to make sure that, you're setting that goal, letting them know what they're going to be learning and doing for that particular class period, having that review, bringing in an element of phonemic awareness, perhaps phonemic awareness that's going to either tie to a skill you've already taught or ideally a skill that's coming up in the next lesson. Also teaching that sound symbol correspondence, explicitly showing, saying the sound, showing the grapheme, talking about the position of the sound in the word and how the position may have an impact on the spelling, right? Those are all the systematized way we teach those sound symbol correspondences. Giving practice for reading those new words. And that's where the whole group, small group comes in, right? Because you can give practice opportunities in whole group, but then you might have learners in small group that need even more practice opportunity. So there's where you can leverage that whole group to small group connection, using some word building and dictation. And then, of course, we don't read words just for the sake of reading words. We want to connect it to actual reading. And that's where our decodable texts are going to come in. And I'll talk about that in just a minute. So just an example of systematic instruction would be, again, connecting the sounds and the symbols and be very systematic and explicit in how we show our students and have them practice how to read those words. So we start with that sound symbol relationship, right? Today, we're going to be learning more about long A. Say A, like the first sound in apron. And today, we're going to be learning how to spell that long A sound with an A, a consonant, and an E. We often call that vowel consonant E. Sometimes we might call it magic E, but magic E is magical because it has lots of jobs. And one of the jobs of magic E is to help the vowel say its name in a vowel consonant E word. So we're going to be looking at and reading words that have vowel consonant E. Let's take a look. Let's start with the word fake. Ache, fake. Let's read the next word together. Aid, made. And I probably have more examples than this, but for our purposes, just a few for right now. Now let's think about how we can read sentences with words that have the long A sound. Wake me up at 6. Let's try that again. Wake me up at 6. Good. Nice job. We also want to include some opportunities to read more words with that sound spelling relationship, but then also write them as well. So let's read together. Okay, first of all, let's point to the vowel, point to the E, long A, came. Point to the vowel, A, point to the E, long vowel A, make. A, tape. A, sail. A, cape. A, late. So I'm focusing in on the vowel and then blending the rest of the word. And then the next step would be to have some supported decoding, dictation practice, right? So I'm not going to show them these words, but I would dictate a word, came. Let's tap out the sounds. K, A, what vowel sound do you hear? A. Let's think about how that A is making the A sound, and then write the word came. And then finally, we're going to connect that to that decodable passage, right? Thinking and making sure that we have decodable passages that give lots of opportunity to practice with that particular skill. Now, I want to back up for a second and talk about that logical scope and sequence. One of the guiding principles in Tier 1 instruction is really to ensure that the skills are sequenced from least complex to more complex. So I want you to take a look at these skills, right? And you're probably noticing, well, these skills I don't think are in order. And you're right, they're not. They're not in order from least complex to more complex. So what I want you to do is to take a piece of paper, maybe a sticky note, some scrap piece of paper. And what I want you to do is just take a moment, 30 seconds or so, and reorder them. Get them in order from least complex to more complex. And I'll give you about 30 seconds or so to do that. All right, let's see how you did. So when I look at these, oh, okay. Sorry, got a message here. All right. So when I look at these skills, the least complex of the skill is those predictable consonants, right? That's where we're starting. That's where we're starting in kindergarten. Perhaps that's where we may need to start in an intervention, right? Because if I think back, let me go back here to your learning progression. What I really like about your learning progression is that it not only has the grade levels across the top, but it also has the progression from novice reading to more skilled reading. So you potentially could have a third grader who is still working through basic phonics concepts. And so, yes, you have your core instruction, but you're also thinking about how you support their needs through that intervention, through that logical scope and sequence. Okay. So we've got that predictable consonant with the short vowels as being kind of the first step there. Then we have the digraphs, right? We typically then follow with the digraphs, the more frequent digraphs, right? Of sh, ch, and f. So the SH representing the sh, the CH representing the ch sound, and the TH representing the f, and then the voice sound, okay? After that, we come to silent E, right? Notice I called it silent E and not necessarily magic E because I mentioned before, E has lots of jobs. That's why we say that it's magical, right? But for our purposes here, we're going to use that vowel consonant E. Also recognizing like words that have the long U sound actually have two sounds. They have the U sound like the word cute and the oo sound like in the word rude. So thinking about your scope and sequence and where the instruction comes in those two sounds of long U. And then we have vowel teams. Now vowel teams are tough, right? This is what makes the English language hard, but not crazy because vowel teams have lots of variability to them. Sometimes in a vowel team, they are position based. Those are often the easiest to teach, or the least, I guess I shouldn't say easiest, the least complex to teach because they're position based, like AI and AY. But other vowels really, they've retained their spelling, but their pronunciation is has morphed over time. So really being cognizant of the progression of the scope and sequence in teaching vowel teams. And then a little bit later, we hit some digraphs again. But this time we're looking for more etymological influences of our digraphs, like the PH sound that we hear and we see in so many of our Greek words. The CH representing the K sound, like in the word chemistry, but also the sh sound, like in the word chef. So I share this with you just so you can, go back after the weekend, open up your scope and sequence, look to see, this is just a sample, right? There's no one scope and sequence that meets everybody's needs, but just take a look at the types of skills that you're teaching and look to see when you're teaching them, and then look to see what the precursor skill was to that particular skill. And just notice, does your scope and sequence move from simple to more complex? Okay. So let's think about some tools and some strategies that you can use to support your students with dyslexia. So I first want to give a nod to engaging all students, right? I'm going to try to channel my Anita Archer the best that I can. And really thinking about instruction not being a passive task, but really being an expressive task, one that students are actively engaged in. And thinking about the methods that we use to engage our students, whether they be verbal and asking them for choral responses, giving them opportunities to turn and talk with a partner, their partner responses, discussions, right? Perhaps, individual responses, but not the, not the guy the kid that's always got his hand raised, right? It's the individual responses after you've given sufficient time to think, right? I see her, Anita, doing this a lot, like really thinking, and then doing a scan of the room using some kind of a pull system like popsicle sticks or, note cards or something like that, where you can shuffle and reintroduce. So thinking about the variable ways that you can engage your students in their verbal responses. Also thinking too, remember that yes, there is that connection to reading, but there's also a direct connection to writing. So how are you engaging your students in writing, right? That written method of engagement, either using their whiteboards, some kind of a response card, maybe a clicker system if you still have those. When it comes time to work on syntax and sentence structure, how are you utilizing writing frames to support that? All of those are methods of engagement to help support the development of those language systems within structured literacy. And then finally, actions, right? How are we including actions? Are they acting out the meaning of a sentence, right? Are they using gestures to help with that key word and the sound? Are they using some kind of hand signal to say, yep, that's the right answer? Nope, that's not the right answer. And what are they doing with their facial expressions? How are you reading those? How are you engaging their facial expressions? And how are you engaging those articulatory gestures of the speech sounds of English to ensure they're producing the correct sounds? So when we think about those areas of engagement, that quality of instruction, really what you're doing is ensuring that all students do everything, right? It's not the individual act of responding. Everyone does everything in one way, shape, or form. And it's holding our students accountable to participating and not calling them out or singling them out, but maybe by proximity, right? If they're not engaged in participating, make yourself available, approximate yourself to where they are so that you're holding them accountable for participating. All of this, though, requires your intentional planning. It's not an on-the-fly kind of thing. It's a deliberate act within your lesson plan to include these different methods of engagement. And then finally, providing that feedback, because providing the feedback is going to help you then adjust your instruction. Did they get it when you provided the feedback? How many times did you have to provide the feedback? Do they need more practice in a particular area? That you can make a note of to include in perhaps some small group instruction. So let's take a look at some scaffolding strategies. And I bring these scaffolding strategies up because many times our learners need scaffolding to a point, but we also have to think about how do we start to remove those scaffolds. When you do a kitchen redesign, or you're building a house, or you're doing some kind of a construction, the scaffolds go up. But as soon as things start to take shape and start to look like what the design is supposed to look like, you start to systematically dismantle the scaffolds. And that's really the goal of scaffolding in instruction, especially with phonemic awareness. So one of the scaffolds with phonemic awareness is, and I'm thinking, a lot for perhaps our learners who are maybe low in their linguistic skills, maybe our English learners, our multilingual learners. Sometimes having that picture, right, is enough Velcro to keep the words stuck in their working memory while they're trying to manipulate the sounds and then to read the words and then do the opposite of that, which is to spell the words. So some of the scaffolds we provide, of course, are some sound boxes where we use those chips, right, to represent a sound. And then we practice the blending of the sounds. Now, I don't have it on this screen, but again, the next step's going to be not just to do the blending and the segmenting of the sounds, but then to remove those chips and systematically place the graphemes into the parking spot. So that's one scaffold we can use. The other scaffold we can use is, the finger touch method. Now, I will say with some learners, tapping the fingers like this, like tapping like one piece to another, sometimes it's hard dexterily for them. So sometimes I just have them count the sounds. I've also worked with learners that I found it more beneficial for them to do all that with their non-dominant hand, so that as we go to write, the symbols, right? Write the graphemes in place of those placeholders there. They can tap and they can write then at the same time. So those are just some initial scaffolds. So if we're thinking about this very, very deliberate type of instruction that we're providing, and we're thinking about starting with the speech and moving into the print to build that dorsal network, we're thinking about how we use those sounds along with the teaching of phonics. All right. And again, I've got a scaffold up there in the top right-hand corner of my screen. So we've been working in whole group and small group and perhaps even in some intervention settings on the E sound, and especially the E sound that's represented by the grapheme EA. All right, so we're going to do some practice with that. So I want you to say the word beach. Okay, good. Now, before we go any further, what's a beach? Yeah, it's a place where there's sand and the water laps up to it. And I show this picture here because, some kids have been to a beach. Others can only, picture it in their mind's eye, right? So I show them this beach so they can keep that in their working memory as we work to read and spell these words. Okay, so what was that word again? Good, it was beach. All right, now let's say the sounds in beach. Yeah, B, E, ch. Making sure we clip that first sound. Sometimes when I say it in a large group, that kind of is detected a little bit, but that's more in my trying to get everything out and people can hear me. But we really want to try to keep that first sound clipped, right? Those stop sounds clipped. B, E, ch. Good. What's the first sound? Second sound? Good. Third sound. Okay. Now let's think about where the phonics piece of it, the attaching to the code comes into play. Okay. So that word was beach. We heard the B, E, ch. Now we've been learning a lot about that long E sound and a way to represent that long E sound. What are the middle letters that are representing that E sound? Yeah, it's the letters EA. Good. So now what I want you to do is I want you to write the letters for each sound. What was the first sound? B. What was that middle sound? E. And what was the last sound? Ch. Good. Beach. Now, I have a question for you. Why is there a CH at the end? Because we learned another way to spell B. We learned another way to spell the ch sound. Why is there a CH there? Yeah, because the sound before it is the long E sound, and that TCH is usually the short vowel marker. Good catch there. Okay, so now let's think about our decoding. Now you wrote that word. Now let's tap out each sound. B, E, ch. Let's use some additive blending. B, E, B, beach. Good. What word? Beach. Awesome. So now let's think about this for a minute. If I change the B sound to the sound T, what word do I have? Write it on your whiteboard. Excellent. It's the word teach. Now let's read it. T, E, ch. Let's use some additive blending. T, E, T, teach. Good. Nice job. Okay. Now remember, it's practice, practice, practice. And if I think back to my lesson plan, my systematic lesson plan, I want to make sure I'm providing opportunities for my students to review previously learned skills while also then learning the new skill. So in this particular lesson, you can see we're interleaving EE, which has already been taught, and EA, which we're talking about, but we haven't had as much practice in this particular skill. So this increases the opportunity for then our students to move into that consolidated phase of learning where that orthographic mapping process is supporting word recognition and that efficient word retrieval. I also want you to notice within this lesson that there are single syllable words and there are also multisyllabic words. And this is going to support younger readers and older readers. makes me think of, I get lots of calls from literacy specialists across our state, all in a panic because of middle of the year, first grade oral reading fluency. And things are going fine, and things are going fine, and things are going fine. And all of a sudden, whoop, down go the oral reading fluency. But if you look at those passages are comprised of multisyllabic words. And so really helping our students to understand, again, reading sound to symbol, but reading through the whole word. Where does morphology come into play, right? This last word variation is really comprised of morphological elements, inflected endings, right? How do we read the base, feed, and then include the suffix ing, feed-ing, eats, sees. So it's that practice, 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 not only in single syllable words, but then multisyllabic words. And you can see here, I've got some, words with, similar patterns, EA, EE, but then I'm also including some endings to those words. When you come to a word like season, right? How many of you have had students who might say season or season? All right. So then you say to them, season. Have you heard that word before? You've got the sounds in there. Let's think about that. Not season, season, right? So we got to flex some of those sounds based on our knowledge and our understanding of language. So you're using that language to help support that process. And then, of course, tying all of this to what the actual act of reading is supposed to be, right? And that's being able to read what's put in front of us. And so including those decodable passages that have a high percentage of the pattern that was taught. So I just want you to take a minute and read this passage and just count up for yourself the number of opportunities for students to read the targeted pattern of EE and EA. I'll give you a moment to do that. Yeah, so I'm looking at this, okay, and I'm looking at, there's green and tree and creek, and then we've got an EA here, so neat, and B and C's and sweet, and now I've got a multisyllabic word, right? Peach, there's the base, peaches, okay, get some schwa in there. On a leaf, another EA. It leaps to eat. Pete, also threw in a long vowel, right? Vowel, consonant, E. Feeds the sheep. Ear. So now we've got that long vowel with the R. The steep, each, sheep. And it's variable, right? We've got some E at the beginning. We've got some E at the middle. Okay. So lots of opportunities to read. Now, along with that passage reading, and for those of you who have gone through some other professional learning, there's probably a routine that you can use, right? To go through and circle, highlight the words that have the pattern, do a read of those words, and then read the passage. Maybe on the next day you have the same passage, but you have a clean passage of it to read it. And then on the third day, you're reading, a brand new passage that has a lot of those same patterns. Now, we're going to talk in just a minute, but I want to bring this up here. This passage, right, and even the one that I showed you before when we were looking at vowel consonant or a consonant E, these passages are not winning the Newbery, right? They're not winning any awards for best literature of the year. But you also have to remember that's not the purpose of them. The purpose of it is to get access, right? This is the connected text that we're talking about, because you learn something, you learned a pattern of the code, and then now you're getting a chance to apply it in a real setting, right? With a passage, right? We also put in some, quotation marks, some different types of punctuation in there to make it seem, a little more like a real kind of story. But the goal of these passages is to practice the patterns that you have learned within a reading. But you've also done some very intentional work on practicing the words in isolation so that they can then be applied into the text. Because teaching that phonics, right, is what's going to help lead to fluency. And fluency is really, it's integrated, right? It's a lot. Fluency is comprised of a lot of different things across the progression and across the grade levels. But fluency, when we acquire enough of the code to read words that can be put into passages like this, it really then provides a purpose for reading. And we can give our learners a purpose for reading after they become more fluent. Now, if I gave you a purpose for reading this passage before we read it the first time, you're probably not going to do very well in answering any question that I gave you when you were finished reading. And that's because you're using up so much cognitive desk space to read the passage that you probably are forgetting what I really wanted you to do, was kind of think for meaning eventually. So keep that in mind too, that it might take some fluency opportunities to reduce the cognitive load so that they can focus on the ultimate goal then, which is the comprehension. But if we initially provide that purpose, it gets them thinking, but you might have to reiterate that with more practice. And then engage in activities for repeated practice with feedback, right? Again, reiterate, it's not about reading fast, right? It's not about getting to the end of the passage before your next door neighbor does. It's about phrasing. It's about attending to punctuation. It's about attending to those capital letters, attending to the words themselves, right? What do the letters and sounds say to read the word? And then we also have to make sure we're providing regular opportunities to read a wide range of text. I believe you're a primarily elementary audience, but if I was working with teachers in upper grades, I would also recommend fluency instruction using some more complex stretch text, right? Grade level text, because then that supports their language, that supports their exposure and their attention to the content, as well as building up their decoding skills, okay? So if you're teaching kindergarten or first grade, right, your fluency is going to be really thinking about, okay, we have sounds in our language. How fluent am I in producing the sounds? Can I name my letters? Do I know that my letters represent sounds? And when I look at AI, can I automatically say A? When I look at EA, can I automatically say E? Or even tell me that E can represent the sound in some words, okay? I'm also then working on my fluency in reading words, and fluency through blending drills can be really powerful for learners, especially with dyslexia. But I do want to make sure that you understand that blending is a scaffold, and we want to start to remove the scaffold as we get more proficient in blending those sounds. So perhaps starting with sound by sound, and then using some additive blending like I showed you before, and then blending the whole word. There might also need to be some scaffolding in the blending of the words that you use as to what sounds you start off with. So words that have continuous sounds like s, sh, those are easier, those are less complex to go through a blending process than words that begin with stop sounds. So that might need to be an instructional adjustment you make perhaps in a small group setting or in an intervention, okay? But I also want to bring up, when we think about fluency in sentences and then fluency in passages, be aware, be on the lookout for low fluency. Fluency, and what I mean by that is fluency that is accurate, but is very laborious, okay? Integrate fluency instruction. I read all those words correctly, but I was labored in my reading. All right. Low fluency like that. I like to think about it as kind of like the canary in the coal mine. It can be an indicator of other issues, right? They obviously don't have the word stored, right, in their word recognition area, in their brain's letterbox. Okay. It can also be an indicator, perhaps they're trying to think of what the word means as they're reading it, and that's slowing and using up the cognitive desk space for the fluent reading. So just think about that fluency indicator as the canary in the coal mine, right? It could be an indicator of some other underlying issue. And of course, consider accuracy. If they aren't accurate, you got to fix that, right? That has to be the first issue that has to be addressed. Okay, so let's just give a quick little nod then to decodable text, right? And some protocols for decodable text. They do need to be read multiple times, right? That helps build fluency, and building that fluency reduces the cognitive load, and they can concentrate on what the actual act is, and that's reading and comprehending. Your decodable text should align with phonics skills that are taught in the scope and sequence. That's why it's best to have decodables that are housed within perhaps a program that you're using. They tend to follow the same scope and sequence. It's not awful if you pull from other sources, but it's not ideal, because what happens is because there's no one scope and sequence that's used, sometimes they get taken out of line. And so they might come to a word that has a pattern that you haven't taught them. And if you don't address it right away, they may resort, which is what a lot of times, poorer readers will do. They'll resort to the guessing game. And that's what you want to take off the table for them, right? You don't want them to guess. You want to use the code. So you got to be careful sometimes in the decodables you use to make sure that they align with the scope and sequence of the programs that you're using. Using several different texts to practice the same skill, right? So remember the routine of practicing with the highlighted words, reading the highlighted words, reading a clean passage, getting a new passage, highlighting the words, and then perhaps maybe on the fourth or fifth day of a lesson, getting a brand new passage that you've internalized and really consolidated those skills within the passage reading. And then use those, right? I mentioned that decodable text are not written for their literary value, right? They're written because they serve a purpose, and that purpose is to practice the code that you taught. But that doesn't mean that you forget about all of the language building and the rich text that have to be used to build the vocabulary and the background knowledge, which helps then to facilitate the word reading process. So as I start to finish up and get to some of your questions this afternoon, I just want to give a nod to some of the types of texts that you might be using and that you might be exposed to in your programs and in your schools. So of course, I've been talking about the decodable text, right? This one serves a purpose in that it's got some, we're working on short vowels. I'm not entirely happy with this one just because it does have some over-reliance on pictures, right? So we don't want to rely on the pictures there to give us. So sometimes what I do with my learners is I cover those up. Before I give them the books, I just take sticky notes and I cover up those pictures so that they are forced to attend to the words. And then we can peel apart the sticky notes and they can use those as confirmation. But I tend to, when I'm looking for decodables, really look for ones that don't have an over-reliance on the picture piece of it. So that's the decodable text, the words in and of themselves. The other type of text would be more of an authentic fiction, right? This is from Amos and Boris, right? Dr. DeSoto, William Steig. And so this is building knowledge, right? This is building some background knowledge. This is building rich language for our students. I'm not expecting a first grader to read this. I probably wouldn't even expect maybe a second grader to read this. But this is a pretty rich read aloud in that it uses complex vocabulary. It has complex language structures. It's getting their ear primed for that more complex language. And then finally, we've also have just some informational text, which is also really important to build that background knowledge. Background knowledge is important, but what it does is it helps facilitate that word reading, because you have to be able to read the word and then confirm whether, you've heard that word before, you know that word. It also helps kind of facilitate that fluency, so that knowledge and vocabulary is not the canary preventing the fluent reading. So I just want to wrap some things up by saying that, when we think about supporting skilled readers, supporting skilled reading for all learners, especially those with characteristics of dyslexia, really take a look at your reading, your tier 1 reading instruction, your core reading instruction, and make sure you're focusing on that structure of the language system. That structure is going to include the word recognition skills, but it's also going to have those read aloud elements of language to later support reading comprehension. And I really like how your version of the reading rope, your reading learning progression, it really shows the implications of when things aren't quite in place. It can really cause a disconnected rope and a more frayed rope. So think about the structure of the language within your instruction. Think about how you teach word recognition skills, and then how do you build up those language processes through oral language. Okay. So in our time together, we identified how the MTSS framework supports students with dyslexia. We defined the essential components of differentiated core literacy instruction that's aligned with the science of reading to meet those diverse needs of our students. And then we described some practical tools and strategies to support reading development for students, with dyslexia or just reading difficulties in general. Okay. I also want to say I applaud you. I'm honored to be able to speak to you this afternoon, and I thank you for all that you do to teach your learners to read. So I'm not sure where we are.
Yeah, thank you so much, Carolyn, for sharing just your wealth of knowledge. I know that you were busy presenting this morning and you were racing to get to us this afternoon. So thank you so much for joining us. There are quite a few questions.
Okay.
Some are still coming in. So we will just start running through some of them. And I know that we have a little bit more time for you to elaborate on that. And we'll just go from there. So, okay, so there were comments about not having perfect curriculum resources. We know that not all there's no perfect resource for curriculum, but what would your suggestions be for locating those missing pieces of the curriculum? Say if there's not a strong morphological component or a phonemic awareness component, what would you do, or where would you locate those?
Yeah, I would really leverage, for things like that. And you're right, like no program is perfect. Even like some of the ones that I consider to be like really good programs are still lacking in areas. I really encourage our schools to first leverage the power of we call them building leadership teams. I think you guys call them school leadership teams. Leverage the power of your teams, both your school level teams and your grade level teams, and look at perhaps some gaps across the grade levels, and use your teaming structures to identify those and then plan systematic supplementals to what you might see. Because what you don't want to do is start piecing and, piecemealing programs together so that now second grade is using something on morphology and third grade is using something else, but they already taught that in second grade, but it's stressed in third, you see what I mean? So I like to leverage the power of the teams, and that really is going to come more as you're getting through like an initial implementation of the program. You're going to start to see those things. And as you start to make tweaks and adjustments, as you get into other stages of implementation, you can start to think about supplementals to pull in. But I like to look at it from a vertical alignment, a grade level alignment, and then also a vertical alignment too.
Yeah, I think that's great that they really need to focus on the communication at that team level so that you do not have just a bunch of random pieces being instructed. So relying on their team in their building. Great. Thank you. Okay. You had talked about this concept of statistical teaching or self-teaching being the purpose of phonics. So is there a certain time in the progression of learning or even age at which students would really be able to apply their knowledge of phonics to that self-teaching?
Yeah. Yeah, so I kind of take it back to Aries phases of word reading and spelling development. Um, I think the age, right, that she kind of quotes typically happens around third-ish grade. But there's also a caveat to that, right, too, because it's not just magically you hit third grade and you can start to, read most of the words. It's really about the instruction that has preceded it, right? So what's the initial instruction that happened when students were in that pre-alphabetic phase, when they were trying to make that association between, print and the scribbles and the sounds, and then the early alphabetic, where they're really starting to make that labored sound symbol relationship. So I think they typically say about third grade. If you kind of look at some of the skills that are contained within consolidated alphabetic, they tend to align with multisyllabic words, inflected endings, things like that.
Yeah, thank you. Now, you also had mentioned that decodables are not going to be winning any awards for their literary content, right? But rather that they serve a purpose, right? And they're bridging our new readers to becoming fluent readers with those phonics skills.
Mm-hmm.
When do you see uncontrolled text being helpful to introduce?
Yeah, I typically think if you can read a grade level passage with a certain percentage of accuracy, if you're getting to a point where you're getting to the end of a scope and sequence, sometimes even in your screening measures, right? Like, where are they in their grade level ORF? Okay, are they reading it with at least 95% accuracy? Can they ask and answer questions about what they're reading? Then you can start to kind of scaffold away. Also think too about that, again, that phases of learning, right? Sometimes kids who are on that cusp of going from later alphabetic into consolidated alphabetic can teeter. But I think you also have to be really careful with that when in moving to that alone, is when do you give them the opportunities to read that? So I see lots of people, and we're really trying to hit this in our state too, is silent reading, right? When you have readers who are kind of on that cusp of later and consolidated alphabetic, and you go send them off to read a grade level text on their own, you don't really know what's happening in that silent reading. So if you're going to make that shift, do it as you are there supporting and giving feedback in their reading, so that they're not going off and practicing something on their own wrong.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense to do that in that controlled environment where they can receive that corrective feedback right away. Yeah, thank you. Okay, so there were some questions about mastery and what is considered mastery, and sometimes programs specify that, and other times they don't. So how would you go about determining that? And then there was other questions sort of related to it about if students are supposed to practice to mastery, whatever that looks like, and not moving forward until that happens. What does that look like?
Yeah, so that's a fine line, right? Because you have this scope and sequence, you have your grade level instruction, you have what your building has identified as those non-negotiables of instruction. I would use that as a leveraging of, okay, I'm introducing something in whole group. I want to make sure I use my screening, perhaps my instructional grouping charts, my formative assessments, to then plan my small group instruction. Because then in my small group instruction, I can give some further So now maybe if I give them, 5 practice opportunities in whole group, I can give them 10 more opportunities in small group. And it might be that learner is also receiving some interventions that's going to take them to mastery also. It's really in the intervention setting. We want kids to master as quick as possible, but it's in the intervention setting that mastery becomes critical before they move on to the next skill, and using that skill-based diagnostic to help in that mastery.
Yeah, I'm really using the data to drive who needs that additional time or additional opportunities.
Yeah. And what kind of practice do you provide? So when you're working, ideally you have you have human capital pushing in when you do small groups, but we know that either doesn't or can't happen in all school settings. So if they're working in some kind of an individual, making sure that their practice is targeted and they're only practicing on things that that they can do on their own.
Yeah. Okay, so a bit of a pivot. There was a question in the chat that says, where does dictation come into this process?
Yeah, so dictation, I don't know if you can still see. Can you guys still see my screen?
No.
I wonder. Oh, there it goes. Okay.
Right. Yeah.
So this is not a platform that I am used to. Dictation comes in. I know I went through this really quickly, so I apologize. Dictation comes in like right here. Okay, so this is primarily the reading. Even you have some encoding where you're doing some word building here, maybe through some tiles or writing, and then you've got dictation where you are including that part of the I'm teaching that EA pattern E, so I'm going to give them a couple words, more words than I gave you with that EA, where I say the word, they segment the word, and then I'm also going to give them a sentence or two to practice writing. So dictation is part of the systematic plan for instruction.
Okay, thank you. All right, so there were a few other decodable questions, especially for our upper elementary. And I know that the focus is on elementary, but even if you have any good resource ideas for secondary, do you have good resources that you would send people to for decodable text?
So I hate to recommend stuff like that, because then somebody always comes back and says, well, you said to do this and it's got this in it. So here's what I would look for upper elementary and even middle school. Just make sure that they're age and grade appropriate. Yes, we're looking for the patterns. We want to make sure that we have that code solidified, but you also have to take into consideration the motivation factor. I do know just one site that you can just go to look in general. I think the Reading League has a list of various vendors or whatever that have decodable books. So you might find something there as you collect samples and things like that.
Yeah, and I think it kind of goes back to there's no perfect curriculum, there's no perfect set of decodables either, and so you do want to really look at it, take it in, and see, does that match your scope and sequence and how you're teaching that with students.
I do know that Dr. Archer has tried really hard in her intervention programs to include decodable decodables within the interventions that she uses, whether it's phonics for reading or rewards or something. But you don't want to take those out of the context of the lesson that you taught to get to those.
Right. Okay, so I know that the focus was mostly elementary, but there was a question about, is there, or what would the difference be between a primary systematic instruction approach and a secondary one? And I suppose when you're talking secondary and working on some of our early literacy skills, we're probably going to be looking at tier 2 or tier 3 support. But would some of that instruction that you're seeing in the early elementary, could that be mirrored or replicated in that tier 2, tier 3 setting at secondary?
Yeah, so I definitely think the systematic plan can be replicated. I think you need to look at the across a 5-day week, though. I think you really need to look at making sure that you're teaching them, the code, but you're also infusing vocabulary of the content area. You're infusing fluency to help read stretch text. You're infusing writing, right? Attention to writing. In our state, I recommend the IES practice guide, the 4 through 9 practice guide. Because it has all of the components. It has the multi-components for an intervention for secondary in a grade appropriate way.
Okay, thank you. A few other questions. How can families best either be supported or engaged as partners in the literacy instruction?
Yeah, that's another question we get a lot. And, the biggest question people get is, what resources can I give to families? And, we've been doing a lot of, a lot of reading on the role of families. And what I'm finding is that families need just they need to convey to their students that, like, school is important, right? Like, we can't expect families to do a systematic phonics lesson. We can't even expect our families, as much as we want to, we can't expect families to read every night to our kids. I mean, as much education as I've had, being a working mom and kids who played sports, and husband who had all hours of the night work, like, it's hard to place that on families. But I really think just the communication of, here's what you're going to learn in school, here's how your teacher is going to support you, bringing families in, but also meeting families where they are. I think we've learned a lot over the years that, family literacy nights are great, but not everybody can come to a family literacy night. Not everybody wants to come to a family literacy night. Like, if you had really bad experiences with school, the last place you want to be is to step inside a school and think about reading and be embarrassed in front of your peers. So it's really about the communication. I will say, as far as resources go, the National Center for Improving Literacy, NSOL, they have some really good infographics on how to help families understand what's happening in school in terms of literacy, and then ways that families can support literacy at home. So I always direct to areas on NSOL to help with that.
Yeah, great. That is a great resource for sure. NCIL, if you go to ncil.org,
Yep.
people will be able to find some really valuable resources. Well, Carolyn, we thank you so much for your time and just for being here with us to just share your information, share your slides. I know people were digging into the slides and found some really valuable resources. So we just appreciate you being here with us.
Yeah, absolutely. And I added something. I always change things up at the very end. So I added things in that they might not have. So I'll get you, Kate, I'll get you another PDF of the slide decks that you guys.
It's like I queued you up to say that. There were a few people that mentioned that. Like, I'm missing a few.
There. I know. Well, you know what? I'm such a bad lesson planner. I'm the kind of person where I think of something in the shower and I'm like, shoot, I didn't put that in there. So then I run to my computer and I add it in, and then I forget that you don't have it.
Well,
so
that's perfect. So if you want to reshare
I will do
the updated slide deck, we can share it out with participants. I know at the end of the session, we'll make sure that any new handouts will be shared out. So we really appreciate that.
I'll log off and I'll email those to you right away.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Carolyn.
Okay. All right.
All right. And everybody else, we are just going to have a little bit of a break longer than we would have had. Our next speaker, Risha Conroy, will be joining us and starting at 2:30. So you have about 27, 28 minutes to get a stretch break and go to the bathroom, and we will see you back then. Thank you.